Remember when American Chopper dominated TV with screaming matches and custom chrome? It was never just about bikes. Behind the scenes, the business was crumbling, the culture was shifting, and the dream was dying. What killed the Chopper? Why did the family fall apart? And what was the final build that nearly ended it all? The death of the Chopper itself. There was a time when just the silhouette of a custom chopper could stop people in their tracks. Massive rear tires, stretched forks, hand-fabricated frames, and paint jobs so wild they looked like something out of a hallucination. These weren't just motorcycles. At the center of this movement was Orange County choppers. Their bikes weren't built in silence. They were born in chaos, forged between welds and shouting matches, broadcast into millions of homes across the country. But today, those same bikes sit silent in museum displays, dusty garages, or auction lots. The world moved on, and the dream that built them died quietly. So what happened to the legendary American Chopper? How did a cultural icon go from ruling the roads to disappearing entirely? It's easy to point to trends or changing tastes, but the truth runs deeper. The fall of the Chopper wasn't just a market shift, it was a cultural collapse. These machines were built to represent freedom, rebellion, and craftsmanship. But when the rebellion became corporate and the craftsmanship turned into a reality show, the spirit behind them started to corrode. Orange County Chopper's signature bikes were never just machines, they were spectacles. Whether it was the fire bike built to honor fallen firefighters or the Comanche bike inspired by military helicopters, OCC injected emotion into steel. Their choppers weren't designed for comfort or even practicality. They were art pieces on wheels, sometimes unrideable, but always unforgettable. Each build had a story, and for a time, those stories connected with a generation that still believed in the American dream of building something with your bare hands. But then something changed. For all their flair, OCC's bikes had a fatal flaw. They weren't made to last, not in the evolving world of motorcycling. As fuel economy standards tightened and emissions regulations got stricter, the big carbureted V-twins that powered OCC's monsters became harder and harder to justify. At the same time, the chopper aesthetic itself started to age poorly. What once looked like rebellion began to look like excess. Giant chrome fenders, exaggerated proportions, and impractical riding positions didn't appeal to younger riders who were gravitating toward minimalism, efficiency, and real-world usability. And then there were the safety issues. Some of OCC's builds were closer to sculptures than motorcycles. Many had no rear suspension. Others had extreme rake angles that compromised handling. Some even pushed legal limits on noise, lighting, or visibility. They were built for television, not for roads, and as laws changed, especially in states like California, which began cracking down on custom exhausts and frame mods, the freedom to ride a chopper became more of a legal gray area than a lifestyle choice. Culturally, the tide had turned. The early 2000s were a moment in time, a post-dot-com pre-recession America that still believed in bigger, louder, flashier. But after the 2008 crash, the national mood changed. Flash became frivolous. Gas prices soared. Riding a chopper that got 20 miles per gallon and roasted your thighs in traffic started to feel out of touch. Motorcycling itself didn't die, but the type of motorcycling that OCC represented did. He was building a legend. And when American Chopper hit television screens in 2002, it didn't just capture viewers, it redefined an entire genre. How American Chopper hijacked the custom motorcycle world. The formula was perfect. Family drama, impossibly tight deadlines, and jaw-dropping machines. Each episode followed a familiar rhythm. Chaos, conflict, creation, and week after week, the audience came back for more. What set American Chopper apart was that it wasn't really about motorcycles, it was about personalities. Paul Sr.'s explosive temper, Paul Jr.'s quiet creativity, Mikey's comic relief, Vinnie's calm competence. These weren't actors, they were real people, building real bikes while really getting under each other's skin. And America couldn't look away. The themed bike era began almost immediately. What started with tribute bikes and local builds quickly turned into corporate commissions. Snap-on tools, Coca-Cola, Lincoln, the New York Yankees, everyone wanted their brand immortalized in OCC steel. The bikes became billboards, the shop became a factory, and the show became a marketing machine. But in chasing mainstream success, something got lost. The soul of the chopper, once about rebellion and self-expression, was being replaced by logos and deadlines. Builds had to be bigger, flashier, faster. The bikes were still beautiful, but they weren't personal anymore. They were product placements on wheels. And the custom bike world noticed. Veteran builders criticized OCC for sacrificing function for flair. Riders complained the bikes were too heavy, too flashy, too corporate. But by then, it didn't matter. The ratings were through the roof. OCC had hijacked the entire chopper narrative, and the original culture was left choking on tire smoke. But the fame machine didn't come without a cost. One bike, one fight, and one moment on camera would tear the whole empire apart. We dug through the builds, the blowups, and the buried truth, so you didn't have to. And if you want more, hit like and subscribe. The bike that broke the family. It was supposed to be their masterpiece, but it tore them apart. By the time the Ferrari bike was commissioned in 2007, OCC was at the peak of its powers and teetering on the edge of implosion. The build was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it became the tipping point in one of the most toxic family relationships ever broadcast on national TV. Paul Jr., the creative mind behind OCC's most iconic designs, had grown tired of his father's overbearing control. Paul Sr., used to being the boss, saw his sons rise as a threat. Their working relationship had deteriorated into shouting matches, passive-aggressive sabotage, and barely contained resentment. The Ferrari bike amplified everything. The build itself was flawed from the start. Clashing visions, sponsor interference, and a ludicrous deadline turned the project into a nightmare. On camera, the tension was electric. Off camera, it was explosive. Paul Sr. accused his son of being lazy. Paul Jr. pushed back, demanding respect. And then, during a now infamous argument about showing up 45 minutes late, Paul Sr. did the unthinkable. He fired his own son on national television. The fallout was instant. Fans were stunned. The network was caught off guard, and OCC was never the same again. What had once been a dysfunctional family held together by bikes became a fractured empire collapsing under its own weight. That moment didn't just end a relationship, it split an empire in two. Two shops, one war. The fallout from the firing of Paul Jr. didn't just fracture a family, it tore a brand in half. And like all good American tragedies, it didn't end with silence. It ended with escalation. What happened next wasn't reconciliation, and it wasn't resolution. It was retaliation. And Paulie didn't retaliate with rage, he retaliated with a wrench. Shortly after being fired in 2008, Paul Jr. made the move that would transform him from a character in his father's story into the author of his own. He launched Paul Jr. Designs, a new shop, a new brand, a new start. But this wasn't just a new business. It was a declaration, a statement that he didn't need his father, didn't need the OCC legacy, and didn't need the constant yelling to build something worth remembering. And he didn't go it alone. Vinnie DiMartino, the quiet, steady presence who'd been the unsung hero behind so many of OCC's most iconic builds, left Orange County Choppers to join Paul Jr. Rick Petco, another crucial fabricator with years of loyalty under his belt, eventually followed suit. These defections were more than resignations. They were rebellions. And for the first time since the show began, viewers saw what OCC looked like without its core builders, and what Paul Jr. could do without the weight of his father's control. As if on cue, Discovery Channel saw the potential for even more drama. If one volatile motorcycle shop could make for addictive reality TV, imagine two shops at war. The result was American Chopper, Senior versus Junior, a new series that split the screen and the audience. On one side, the old empire. On the other, the rising sun. Each week, viewers watched as Paul Sr. and Paul Jr. raced to outbuild each other. Deadlines were tighter, themes were louder, the insults got sharper. But while the drama kept eyes glued to the screen, the cracks in both empires were widening behind the scenes. What had started as a father-son workshop had now become a televised arms race, and the pressure was relentless. Paul Jr. focused on sleek, thematic bikes that honored form without sacrificing function. His designs were thoughtful, even elegant, reminiscent of the early OCC builds before branding deals diluted the craftsmanship. Meanwhile, Paul Sr. doubled down on spectacle. Bigger frames, wilder themes, more chrome, more muscle, more money. But with every over-the-top build, something intangible was getting lost. The viewers thought they were watching a competition. What they didn't realize was that both shops were already burning out, and the longer the war dragged on, the more fragile everything became. But no one realized how fast the house of cards was collapsing, and it wasn't just about business, it was about legacy. When Paulie outbuilt his dad. As Paul Jr. designs found its rhythm, something remarkable happened. The son began to eclipse the father, not just in fan favor but in creative credibility. What started as a splinter group of ex-OCC fabricators quietly became the gold standard in the custom chopper scene. The bikes were simpler, cleaner, and more refined. They didn't scream, they spoke. Paul Jr. was proving week after week that he didn't need a massive headquarters or a merchandising empire to build something beautiful. His bikes blended narrative and form, honoring their themes without becoming caricatures. He brought restraint to an industry known for excess, and the results spoke for themselves. Industry insiders took notice. Bike magazines that once covered OCC with awe started shifting their attention. The buzz around OCC began to fade. The public still tuned in to see what the Tuttles would fight about, but the builds, they were becoming secondary. Meanwhile, OCC leaned even harder into gimmicks. Overbuilt frames, over-chromed finishes, corporate logos on every tank. It felt like the heart had been traded for branding. Paul Sr. was trying to recreate the magic with volume, not vision. But every extravagant bike only reminded viewers how much they missed the soul. What made this shift even more dramatic was that Paul Jr. never gloated. He never attacked his father publicly. He simply built better bikes. He let the work speak. And in an industry where reputation is everything, silence can be louder than shouting. The tide had turned, and fans knew it. Paul Jr. had become the keeper of the craft. Paul Sr. had become a caricature of his former self. Then Sr. made the one call no one expected. The forced reunion that didn't work. By the early 2010s, American Chopper was gasping for relevance. Viewership was down. The original magic was long gone. So Discovery Channel did what desperate networks often do. They tried to force a resolution. The producers pitched a final season that would reunite Paul Sr. and Paul Jr. under one roof. Not permanently, but enough to create the illusion of peace. Cameras would roll, old grievances would be aired, and maybe, just maybe, father and son could build something together one last time. The result: awkward tension. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes, conversations that felt more like cold negotiations than family bonding. Viewers saw through it. The emotional weight that once made American Chopper compelling had been replaced by scripted hugs and silent resentment. Paul Sr. struggled to relinquish control. Paul Jr. hesitated to engage. Mikey, once the comic relief, looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. What was meant to be a cathartic close became a painful reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Even the bikes felt lifeless. The passion was missing. The builds lacked spark. And the fans, once so invested, began tuning out for good. By the final episode, it was clear. Some things couldn't be fixed. Some wounds never heal. The reunion wasn't a comeback, it was a confirmation. The cameras stopped rolling, but while Sr. burned bridges and tightened his grip, the true craftsmen who built those bikes were quietly finding new roads. Vinnie, Rick, and the real builders behind the bikes. In the chaos of American Chopper's prime, it was easy to get distracted by the yelling, the slamming doors, and the broken office furniture. But behind every screaming match was a group of men with welding torches and socket wrenches quietly making magic happen. Vinnie DiMartino and Rick Petco weren't the loudest voices in the shop, but without them, those legendary bikes would have never made it off the lift. Vinnie was the first breakout star behind the scenes. Introduced in the early 2000s, he quickly became a fan favorite. Calm, humble, and absurdly talented, Vinnie brought a steady presence to the show. When deadlines loomed or tempers flared, he kept his head down and kept building. His fabrication work was precise, his mechanical instincts sharp, and his attitude made him the opposite of everything wrong with OCC's leadership. Rick Petco, another powerhouse in the shop, joined shortly after and brought with him a deep understanding of metalworking and ride dynamics. Together, Vinnie and Rick became the unspoken backbone of OCC. When Paul Jr. dreamed up wild designs, it was these guys who figured out how to make it real. When parts didn't fit, timelines shrank, or builds veered off course, they solved the problems without drama. But as OCC descended into dysfunction, both men saw the writing on the wall. Vinnie was the first to leave, starting his own shop, V-Force Customs. Rick stayed a bit longer, trying to stay loyal, but eventually stepped away to start Petco's Ironworks. Both were tired of being part of a circus. They wanted to build, not perform. But in the mainstream memory of American chopper, that craftsmanship often got buried beneath the drama. The public didn't remember the long hours or the steady hands, they remembered the shouting. And while the builders moved on with dignity, OCC tried something no one expected: a total reset. OCC's last ride, the Florida move that went nowhere. By the late 2010s, Orange County Choppers was no longer what it used to be. The massive New York compound was more mausoleum than workshop, echoing with the ghost of builds long finished and relationships long broken. So in an act of reinvention, or perhaps desperation, Paul Sr. made a move, literally. OCC was relocated from Newburgh, New York to Pinellas County, Florida. The new space was supposed to be smaller, sleeker, and more in tune with the future. Investors came in, funding was secured, and there was even talk of electric motorcycles. It was marketed as a comeback, but in truth, it was a retreat. The new OCC had none of the grit. The floors were polished, the walls were glass, and the vibe was corporate. There were touchscreen kiosks, digital mock-ups, and showroom bikes that had never touched pavement. They tried to embrace electric vehicle culture, offering prototypes that felt more like marketing exercises than genuine innovation. Gone was the thunder of a 1,800 cubic centimeter V-twin engine. In its place, a silent, soulless shell. The problem wasn't just the tech, it was identity. OCC wasn't built for the future. It was a product of 2004. It was testosterone, torque, and tribal flames. It was analog grit in a digital world. The Florida shop tried to pivot, but without Paul Jr., without the original builders, and without the cultural moment that had made it relevant, the new OCC was just a brand without a backbone. Visitors came, curious to see what remained, but the showroom was often quiet. The builds felt sterile, and fans whispered the truth. OCC was done. But just as the showroom lights dimmed, the internet lit up. An American chopper was about to be reborn in the weirdest way possible. And in that irony was a warning, because once your legacy becomes a punchline, it's hard to build it back. Why the chopper died everywhere. At its height, Orange County Choppers was not just building motorcycles, it was building monuments. These were not bikes you simply rode, they were the kind you posed next to, the kind you saw on posters in mechanic shops and behind the counters of fast food joints. But by the time OCC was a household name, the very culture that made choppers iconic was already starting to disappear. The truth is, these extravagant, one-of-a-kind machines belonged to a different America, an America that was about to get hit hard. The financial crash of 2008 didn't just wipe out housing markets and bank accounts, it crushed the custom motorcycle economy. OCC's golden era coincided with a time when credit was easy, Harley Davidson was thriving, and custom builders were in high demand. But when the recession hit, the middle-class dream of owning a flashy chopper vanished overnight. People were losing jobs, not buying $25,000 motorcycles. Custom shops closed. Orders dried up. The industry, which had exploded in the early 2000s, imploded in just a few years. But it wasn't just economics that killed the chopper, it was a shift in taste. By 2010, motorcycle buyers weren't chasing chrome and flame decals. They were looking for simplicity, efficiency, and authenticity. The younger generation didn't want to ride a bike that looked like a spaceship with ape hangers. They wanted something minimal, something retro, something that actually worked. They turned to bikes like the Triumph Bonneville, the Honda CB series, and stripped-down cafe racers that could be daily commuters, not just museum pieces. And there were practical reasons too. Choppers, by design, are not rider-friendly. Their stretched frames, raked forks, and massive tires might look aggressive, but they're not made for actual riding. They're hard to steer, uncomfortable on long rides, and usually lack any kind of real suspension or braking refinement. As regulations tightened on emissions and safety, many chopper builds struggled to meet roadworthiness standards. And while OCC's bikes were mostly showpieces, even their fans began to question how rideable these machines actually were. Then came the rise of electric motorcycles and adventure bikes, two categories that couldn't be further from the chopper's DNA. Riders started looking for utility, range, off-road capability, and digital integration. OCC tried to keep up, at one point even teasing an electric prototype, but by then the brand was too entrenched in the past. The culture had changed. The image of a leather-clad rider on a fire-breathing chopper was replaced by YouTubers on dual sports and commuters on zero-emission scooters. But buried in that cultural collapse was one last ember. One last bike. One last moment that would bring the Tuttles back together, even if only for a brief spark. But there was still one last gasp left in the OCC story. From reality TV to real tragedy. For years, the yelling on American Chopper was part of the show. It was loud, over the top, and often hilarious. But behind the shouting matches and deadline stress was something real, something much heavier. No one embodied that toll more than Mikey. Once the comic relief of the show, Mikey Tuttle was the heart of American Chopper. He brought levity, absurdity, and humanity to an otherwise intense work environment. But the pressure of being caught between his warring father and brother took a mental toll. Mikey struggled with addiction, depression, and isolation as the family feud escalated. He often found himself walking out of the shop, not for drama, but for survival. The deeper the family fractured, the harder it became to separate performance from reality. Lawsuits between Paul Sr. and Paul Jr. weren't just legal maneuvers, they were acts of war. At one point, Sr. tried to force Jr. to sell back his stake in OCC, triggering a bitter legal battle that dragged on for years. The courtroom became an extension of the workshop, a place where grudges were forged in steel and resentment. Even the builders, the quiet craftsmen like Vinnie and Rick, felt the heat. They were no longer just welders and fabricators. They were characters. And being characters meant being edited, directed, and pushed into conflicts that blurred the line between workplace and soap opera. The emotional labor was real, the fallout permanent. Yet through all the pain, there was still a desire, maybe even a need to build something again, to finish something they'd left undone. Paul Sr., worn down by age and regret. Paul Jr., still carrying the creative torch. And Mikey, quiet but ever hopeful that the family could come together for something that wasn't about money, ratings, or courtrooms. And so, despite everything, they agreed to build one last bike. Together. Then came the final build. The last bike they ever built together. It wasn't announced with fanfare. There was no special episode, no dramatic countdown clock, no artificial tension, just a quiet agreement between father and son. Let's build one more. The last bike from OCC wasn't about sponsors or contracts. It was about closure. The shop looked different. The faces had changed. The cameras were mostly gone. But the work remained the same. Steel had to be cut. Tubes had to be bent. Paint had to be sprayed. And for the first time in years, Paul Sr. and Paul Jr. were not fighting. They were creating. The bike itself was a hybrid of old and new. It pulled from their earliest builds, the low-slung silhouettes, the sweeping tank lines, but with cleaner proportions, more functionality, and none of the cartoon excess. Junior's design was restrained, elegant even. Senior respected that. Maybe for the first time in a long time, they saw eye to eye. Vinnie returned briefly, not as an employee, but as a friend. Rick popped in. Mikey hung around the shop, painting abstract art and cracking jokes. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. And when the bike finally rolled off the lift, fully assembled, it didn't just represent craftsmanship. It represented a shared history that had finally been acknowledged. The crew gathered around it. Some cried, some just stared. Because that bike wasn't just a machine, it was the last thread between two men who had given so much and lost even more. But the story didn't end with that build. The bike was finished, but the story wasn't. What the American Chopper really meant. To understand American Chopper is to understand America in the early 2000s. A country torn between tradition and change. A generation raised on hard work, tools, and pride, colliding with a new one searching for meaning, freedom, and expression. The shop was a forge, not just for bikes, but for identity, for masculinity, for family. And like many American stories, it burned bright, then burned out. Paul Sr. represented the old guard. Tough love, harder fists, and an even harder shell. Paul Jr. represented something new. Creative, imperfect, visionary. Their conflict was universal. Fathers and sons. Order and rebellion. The past and the future. The show told us it was about motorcycles. It wasn't. It was about what happens when pride overtakes partnership, when legacy turns into control, when craftsmanship becomes content. And yet, despite all the dysfunction, there was something undeniably powerful about what they built. The bikes may not have been practical, but they were bold, defiant, beautiful in their chaos. They reminded a nation that steel could be bent into art and that art could come from anywhere, even a dusty garage in upstate New York. The fans never really cared about the specs. They cared about the people. They saw themselves in the fights, in the reconciliation attempts, in the stubbornness and creativity, and that's why American Chopper still lingers. Not just as a show, but as a symbol. If you felt that, drop a like. Want more? Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.